strictly kosher, and thanks again to the Amateur Turnberry Jewish Center for enabling this, its members and non-members for coming. This is course number 3, and the title is Israel's Nuclear Ambiguity, essentially discussing probably the world's worst, best kept secret. It's also, there was some thought put into the order of the lectures, and I want to sort of let you into my strategic thinking when we started with, just to put this in perspective for those of you who haven't been to the previous 2 classes, we started off with a little bit of a recap regarding Israel-diaspora relations through history. So even before the creation of the modern state, what was going on in what's now Israel, what happened during 2,000 years without a sovereign state of Israel, and which major communities developed and then dissipated during those 2,000 years, and some of the complexities of the relationship between Jews living in Israel and in the diaspora. And then we talked about the Holocaust and the culmination of that tragedy and the segue into the creation of the modern state, what happened, what it meant for Jews alive at that time, what it means for Jews who were born thereafter, what is the meaning of a survivor, what is the meaning of Jewish identity, and what can we anticipate as post-Holocaust Jewish identity as we move towards a period of time when the survivors will no longer be with us, and we will no longer have this perceived wisdom when you can actually see and hear from the victims, survivors, and heroes themselves, but rather when you're learning about it as another critical milestone in Jewish history. And now we come to this concept of Israel's nuclear opacity or nuclear ambiguity. Can everybody hear me? Okay. So to me, this wasn't an obvious topic to include. Our president, Alan Feingold, who will be joining us shortly, who spoke briefly last time, has a lot of insight, and hopefully he'll have a chance to reflect some of his personal thoughts as well when he does get here, but I also welcome all of your comments. This idea of nuclear power, and I'll be delicate. First of all, I don't know all the answers. I don't know who does know all the answers, but I'm going to try to be as non-cheeky as possible. So the cliches and the euphemisms, the textile factory in Dimona, the metallurgical plant in the Negev, I'll try to sort of identify when some of those comments were purposefully introduced into the discourse regarding the history of Israel within the nuclear age. And I want to also be responsive to some comments I get. By the way, your feedback is important to me. And some of the feedback I got after the last couple of classes is we like the history. Certainly people who were here last year, you can dive a little deeper down into the historical underpinnings of how we got here, so I will do that without going overboard. And we want to hear about Iran, and we want to hear about Hezbollah. And the good news about being able to get up and speak to all of you without notes is that if I prepared notes, they'd be stale before I walked into the classroom, because we're in a dynamic where things change all the time. And even the airstrike that may or may not have been initiated by Israel that took out an Iranian general and 6 members of Hezbollah is extremely relevant to what we're talking about this afternoon. So, what is nuclear energy? Does anybody want to volunteer, or should I just tell you? Yes?
I think the assertion that is most likely concerned here is nuclear energy as a result of splitting heavy atoms.
Right. So that's a good point. So the splitting of an atom, and this gentleman introduces us to a concept of fission, where an atom separates, and that is the basis of the first nuclear bomb, the ones that were developed by the Americans in the Manhattan Project famously. Then there's also a thermonuclear process called fusion, where you're actually using the splitting of the atom to generate another reaction where atoms merge and create even more energy. That's famously called the hydrogen bomb. So if you go back, this concept of the atomic age, as we now call it, started pretty much at the very beginning of the 20th century. People like Marie Curie, Ernest Rutherford, and Niels Bohr were passionate about understanding how the atom worked, and soon discovered in the 1930s that the atom can be manipulated to release enormous amounts of energy, and you can only imagine that people would have thought, how can this be used as a military weapon as well? Germany was a very advanced country. Ironically, up until 1933, Germany may have been the most advanced scientific country. The seizing of power by the Nazis actually hurt the Germans from a scientific standpoint for many, many reasons, not the least of which is they disenfranchised all their Jews. So they kicked them out of the research institutions and stripped them of their ability to participate in German academic life. There were still some very capable German scientists. Otto Hahn, Otto Strauss, Liz Meitner were leading non-Jewish German engineers, but there were many, many German Jews. Albert Einstein is the most famous, who said, I'm not sticking around here, I'm leaving, and he went to Princeton and had a critical role to play. We'll talk about that. Enrico Fermi, the Italian, who wasn't Jewish, but his wife Laura was. So they left, and he moved to Chicago and was the architect of the first nuclear chain reaction, which really was the catalyst for the Manhattan Project moving towards its first test. So we have an ability to be proud of the Jewish contribution to the atomic age. And whether it's Leo Szilard, who co-authored the letter with Albert Einstein to President Roosevelt, or Edward Teller, who was involved in all the research, difficult character, but he's the father of the thermonuclear hydrogen bomb. Samuel Cohen, who was the brainchild of the neutron bomb, which came later in the mid-late 50s. So Jews were disproportionately active. Leslie Grove was administratively responsible for the Manhattan Project, but all of the sort of academic initiative was in the hands of Robert Oppenheimer, another Jew. So this idea of racing against the Germans to be the first to harness the power of the atom was what enabled the Manhattan Project to take place. The Einstein-Szilard letter really was the impetus. It took place way before the United States formally entered the war. Ironically, President Roosevelt signed the letter to enable the Manhattan Project on December 6th, 1941, one day before Pearl Harbor. So this was the race. So we had the German scientists that we were talking about. The Germans were obviously distracted. England had a role to play, but their scientists similarly were tapped into what was going on in the Manhattan Project. There was the Quebec Protocol in 1942, where this idea of secrecy among the Allies was entrenched, and Fermi in the University of Chicago led the effort that produced the first nuclear chain reaction. The laboratories in New Mexico, Los Alamos being the most famous, the facility in Tennessee, and ultimately in July 16th, 1945, they tested the first fission, Trinity, successfully in the New Mexican desert, and 3 weeks later, two bombs, a gun-type bomb called Little Boy was dropped on Hiroshima, and then 2 days later on Nagasaki, they dropped a different technology, testing out both of them on Nagasaki. And that ended World War II in the Pacific Theater. And that was the only time that nuclear weapons were ever used in wartime. And it was such a powerful message to the rest of the world. This is how wars can end, devastatingly. And President Truman, who became president after President Roosevelt died in April 12th, 1945, his first decision, think about it, he becomes president in April, in July they test it, in August they drop it. The United States was suffering enormous casualties in the Pacific. In every island, Guam, Iwo Jima, the losses were catastrophic. POWs were coming back, or not coming back, but the atrocities that were perpetrated upon them in the Japanese POW camps were very intimidating, and President Roosevelt knew that if we actually had to go and take Japan using conventional force, then the casualties probably would pale in comparison to the 100,000 people who perished in Hiroshima. But but the shock to the system could not have been delivered more forcefully. So this was a wake-up call to the entire world that the most powerful force on Earth has now been deployed in war, and the Japanese surrendered unconditionally. And within the Germans had already surrendered. The Germans had already surrendered in May in the European theater. So that was it. That was the end of World War II. But it was also a wake-up call to the rest of the world. So the Soviet Union already had its own designs. The Iron Curtain had already fallen on Europe. The allocation of influence within that part of the world was taking place, and the Soviets clearly were now racing towards that. The Soviet Union did not harness the atom and test its first weapon until 1949, 4 years after. They were the second to do it. And England and France, recognizing that they too needed to be great powers and therefore be able to, when they started the United Nations, there was the P5. So the United States, the Soviet Union, France, England, and China. And England was next in the early 50s. The English scientists, by the way, were working very closely with the American scientists and the newly American scientists. You think of Leo Szilard and Edward Teller and Hungarian, Einstein was German, but the new, Fermi was Italian. The American group under Oppenheimer worked very closely with the British, so the British were pretty quick to get a nuclear device in the early 50s. France didn't have one yet, but they wanted one. So we'll put France on the side, and we'll get to them in a second. What's going on in Israel? In Israel, they're fighting to create this state, and they know that they're going to be attacked as soon as independence is declared. May 14th, 1948, Friday afternoon, around this time, 2 o'clock in the afternoon before Shabbat, Ben-Gurion declares independence. But even before that, he was very curious, very tenacious about how those brilliant minds who enabled the Manhattan Project to develop this power, and the disproportionate number of Jews who participated in that effort, can be recruited to enable Israel to get a nuclear weapon. Think about it. Russia, the Soviet Union didn't have it yet. Only one country had demonstrated its ability to harness the power of the atom, and with a collection of these most brilliant scientists from all over the world, but Ben-Gurion, God bless him, he decided that Israel needed one too. So what did he do? He approached the head of the Weizmann Institute, a fellow by the name of Ernst David Bergman, and said, what do you need to build a bomb? You know, what goes into this process? So, well, we need uranium. All right, well, let's see whether we can mine uranium in the Negev, and they did. They actually found a way to get uranium out of phosphate in the Negev. They also found some pretty efficient ways to generate heavy water, not in weapons-grade quantities, but they patented this. I mean, this is the genius and chutzpah of the Israelis. They patented these two innovations in the early 50s, and then they sold it to the French for $60 million, which is a lot of money in 1952. They sold it to the Commissariat d'Énergie Atomique, the equivalent of the French, it's called the CIA, French Atomic Agency. And the French and the Israelis started cooperating wonderfully. The Israeli scientists had access to the French nascent reactor in Mercoul, and the interplay between the Israelis and the French was such that if you read people's reflection on research that was taking place regarding nuclear energy at that time, it was very intimate. It also reflected, by the way, the relationship that France had with Israel from, with respect to supplying military equipment. So before the creation of the modern state, Israel had absolutely no allies. No country came up and said, we are going to supply the nascent Jewish state with weapons. It had access. It bought and stole and made all sorts of things that enabled it to win the war. But the United States famously had an embargo on selling any arms to the Middle East. It wasn't specifically directed against Israel, but Israel was obviously disproportionately affected. You know, the Czech government sold some weapons. Israel's Air Force was made up largely of Messerschmitts from the Luftwaffe. and then British Spitfires, but it was all sort of a cutting and pasting Band-Aid type of, I think of Cuba today, would try to build a real army. Cuba's already a real country. Israel wasn't a real country, and they were still going with this makeshift process that won. It prevailed at a very high price, but now it wants to be protected. So the best and brightest scientists were put in something called Chemed Gimel. That was the group to figure out how to do all this research. It then moved over from the IDF. Chemed Gimel was a unit in the Israeli Defense Force. It moved over to the Ministry of Defense, which is a code word for the intelligence agencies. And then they had what was called Machon Arba. The United States, at the same time, after Truman served out his second term and Eisenhower became president of the United States, Eisenhower used his position as former, head of the armed forces to say that the horrors of the nuclear power for military purposes are so incalculable that we are going to, and there's a great propaganda, both towards the rest of the world and towards the Russians, who now had, remember, the Russians in 53, when Eisenhower became president, already had weapons. So he initiated something called Atoms for Peace. Atoms for Peace is, we'll put a smiley face on it. The first country that stepped up and said, I want to do this, was Turkey. Israel was the second. And they built a research facility for friendly atomic energy in Nachal Sorek. It's still there if you're driving it, just near Ashdod. And that is a nuclear research facility. It was a decoy, right? Because what they really wanted to do was starting to build something in Dimona. But in 1955, the Israelis signed on as Atoms for Peace. So did the Indians. And the Indians tested their first device in the late 50s and called it the Smiling Buddha, right? It was supposed to be, sorry, in the 70s. They joined the Atoms for Peace program in the 50s, but Pakistan, Iran, the Shah of Iran was a member partner to the Atoms for Peace. You want to talk about when the Iranian nuclear program started? It started during the Eisenhower administration. So we are talking about a country that has been dabbling with nuclear research under one umbrella or another for 60 plus years. So this is an important thing to keep in mind as we're talking about the Israeli entree onto the world stage as a threshold nuclear research country. The relationship with the French was critical. And Shimon Peres, and we're going to talk about some architects, Shimon Peres was one of the critical architects of cultivating this relationship with France and enabling Israel to benefit from the French research. Now remember what was going on at the time, right? France had its hands full in North Africa. Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria certainly was the worst. Israel at the same time was bringing over hundreds of thousands of Jews from that part of the world with incredible intelligence. Right? They lived there. They were now coming to Israel, and they knew the leaders, they knew the business community, they knew certain instigators. I mean, it was all part of that knowledge base, which wasn't that useful for Israel, but it was extremely useful for France. So that was another enabler between Israel and France at the same time that really solidified this relationship. And then obviously when Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956, the French took the lead in this sort of choreographed play whereby Israel was going to go invade the Sinai, try to capture the Suez Canal, and England and France were then going to intervene and say, whoa, come on kids, learn to play nicely in your own sandbox, they'll be the heroes. And we talked about this last year, and we'll talk about it in the last class when we talk about the U.S.-Israel relations. It doesn't have much to do with the discussion on nuclear ambiguity, but both the United States and the Soviet Union at the time combined to tell the two other great powers, you overstepped your boundaries, you may have been a great power 50 years ago, you're not, we are, back off. And that was the end of the Sinai campaign, but it engendered a little bit of sort of what we kind of owe you guys, and the French then came and sent hundreds of engineers to work on this facility in Dimona and build it. In 1958, de Gaulle becomes the head of France, and he didn't like this. He wasn't necessarily anti-Israel yet, but he didn't really see this upstart country belonging. Remember, China only tested its first device in 1964. So he didn't really see this country. France officially tested its first device in 1960. So he thought it was premature for Israel to even pretend to join that illustrious category of countries that has access to, harnessing the power of the atom. Eisenhower was not a fan. We'll talk about this in the last class. Eisenhower certainly did all the right things in his role as general, and he's on record for saying some very powerful stuff regarding the imperative of remembering the Holocaust. But his relationship with Ben-Gurion and Moshe Sharet for a brief period was unremarkable. He wasn't a fan. He thought that Israel was a little bit too big for its britches, and he didn't have any interest in seeing Israel do it. And he wanted to inspect the facilities, but he didn't insist on it. The person who insisted on it was President Kennedy. When President Kennedy gets his intelligence dossier in 1961 as he assumes office, he adamantly wanted to put an end to Israeli mischief with nuclear weapons. And Kennedy is regarded as a very popular president. His relationships with the Jewish community were adequate, but his insistence on shutting down completely any Israeli military activity with respect to nuclear weapons was unconstrained. But he was busy. He had other stuff to deal with. He had they had the Cuban Missile Crisis. First they had the Bay of Pigs, and they had the Cuban Missile Crisis. He didn't have enough time, and when he did send a group of inspectors, so they had a U-2 spy plane that went over. This is what got Kennedy up in arms. And they had a U-2 spy plane in 1960 that actually saw and filmed the facility. You can actually see a picture, and you see the dome. Thereafter, planes were no longer allowed to fly over the facility at all. I mean, there are no flights. Private flights or commercial flights, if you have a private plane and you're in a private plane, you want to go anywhere, you've got to go pretty far around that facility. I don't know if Google Maps doesn't have access to this. You just see like a little, I've tried to look this up, you'll see it sort of glossed over. There are other places in Israel that you'll see glossed over. But the Kennedy administration's insistence on shutting this down was pretty adamant. I mean, this fueled, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, and I don't know Oliver Stone, and I don't know if Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, but there were certainly a lot of conspiracy theorists who argued that the Mossad would have had a role. There were a long list of people who were angry with Kennedy. The mob, CIA, the Russians, but he was on record writing to Prime Minister Ben-Gurion saying, get rid of this. The United States has no tolerance. There's a famous letter. The United States will not tolerate the introduction of nuclear weapons into the Middle East. And Ben-Gurion resigned in the spring of '63. Levi Eshkol became the new prime minister. He was very much on the fence on how to deal with Kennedy. He was, in my view, the most underrated prime minister in Israel's history. I don't deign to say he was the greatest, but certainly the most underrated. People talk about Begin, people talk about Ben-Gurion, people talk about Rabin. I think Levi Eshkol deserves, and again, we'll talk about this in the last class, a lot more credit for many of the things that he was able to do and many of the things that he didn't do. But he was ambiguous. Ben-Gurion wasn't. Ben-Gurion was very clear that the way to play this is to play it cheekily and not to admit, not to let people in. They built decoy control rooms. The first time the Americans came to inspect, you had access to several facilities completely bricked over, and you had a completely fake control room. It looked and felt the same way a control room would look like, with the monitors and everything else, but it wasn't the control room that was connected to the research that was actually being done in Machon Arba. And then the Americans got suspicious. They weren't stupid. They weren't in a position to push. But, and again, we're still in a period of time